Hi, how are you all doing? I'm Mars, welcome to my channel. So for this video I'm creating a creature for the latest Sparked challenge. So I've already done one of these videos where I made a Selkie, which is a sea being from Irish mythology. I'm going to link the video to that in the description if you want to check it out. For this video I decided to stick with Irish myths, so I'm making a Banshee. So I'm just going to give a little description as to what a Banshee is in case you're not sure. So a Banshee, which actually means woman of the fairy mound, was considered to be a harbinger of death and doom, and the first accounts of this creature date back to the 14th century in Ireland. There's also similar tales of creatures like them in Scotland and Wales. So as I said, she was a harbinger of death, and she would often appear before someone entered a situation where they were likely to die. In a few stories, the Banshee would speak out, tell exactly who would die and how, but most of the time they would just wail. And they're also known as wailing women for this reason. So the wail could be heard for miles, and some stories described glass windows shattering because of how loud it was. And this scream was terrifying. Like, people would hear it and they'd immediately be afraid because they knew that it meant death was coming. There are old tales of battles being abandoned by soldiers after they heard the wailing coming from the woods. They'd be terrified in case a banshee was signalling their impending death and they'd flee. Of course, then they would usually die because they would be killed by their enemies while running away, or by their own armies for desertion, or simply by the elements if they stayed in hiding. So every time then somebody would die, that would make the legend of the Banshee grow and grow. So some descriptions of the Banshee have her appear as like a young maiden, and she would lure people toward her with a song kind of similar to like a siren. Generally speaking though, she's described as an old wretched crone. That's kind of the most common description of a Banshee, and that's the version I went with for this video. But whatever her form, she would be dressed in a grey cloak and her eyes would be permanently red because she would be constantly weeping. Now, this may seem like the Banshee is an evil figure or a ghoulish figure, but there's no record of them being violent or even mischievous. Really, they were just there to warn people, and most myths that go into their origins say that Banshees had a very tragic life. Some stories say that they were the spirits of women who were murdered or died in childbirth. Others believed that they were fairy queens who were driven underground by the arrival of humans. So basically, either way, the Banshee is a sad figure who is unhappy herself and is warning people about death. She's not causing it. Banshees are also capable of devotion. Each Banshee was said to serve a specific family and would spend centuries trailing the children of that family. They're also deeply devoted to Ireland, so they would only attach themselves to families who descended from Celts, not from Normans or Saxons. There's also clues that they were attracted to wealth and nobility. Some of the legends say they would only actually serve ancient Celtic noble families, and others claim that before the death of an important leader, multiple Banshees would come together in mourning. Now, something really interesting that I found out while looking up this video, because I wanted to kind of make sure I had as much information on Banshees as I could, was that there are actually some real people in Ireland who kind of had a similar role. So women, they were called keeners, were hired to grieve at a funeral or outside of a house where someone was expected to die. They would wail and scream songs kind of to inspire other people to grieve, and records show that this practice started in the 8th century and actually continued until the 1950s. I mean, it was in decline for some time, but I think the last cases were in the 1950s. It basically got stopped because the Catholic Church believed it was too similar to pagan practices and they didn't like people doing it anymore. But seriously, I found that so fascinating because I'd actually never heard of that before. So because you had these women who were actually screaming and crying at funerals, it kind of makes sense that people took that and turned it into a myth, and then could imagine they hear screaming and crying, and then imagined that it was this fairy figure doing it as opposed to just actual people. But yeah, so I found that so interesting. I hope you guys did too. But so yeah, for the video here, as I said, I went with the crone figure for the Banshee because that's just the most common. Like when I think of a Banshee, that's what I imagine. I imagine this old woman with pale skin. She's so gaunt because she's just wasting away. She's kind of like ghostly. So that's what I went with, you know. She's wearing just a long black dress. This is kind of sad, but I put that scar on her mouth for the reason that I kind of imagined someone coming across her and trying to make her stop screaming, thinking that she was evil, even though, as I've just described, she wasn't. So that's actually really grim, but I wanted to use some of the kind of the scars and the supernatural things that we got in this, so she didn't just look like a normal human, which is why I also gave her the spiky teeth, just because kind of, you know, she's in some myths she's a fairy woman, so I wanted her to look not totally human, so that as soon as you'd see her, as soon as she'd open her mouth to scream, she would look so different. So for her traits, obviously I went with gloomy because of, well, she's crying all the time. She's a loner because she's just hiding out in the woods. I went with perfectionist because I feel like she is really good at her job. So the name I went with for her is Brona, which is an Irish name meaning sorrow. Then Banshee is the surname because that has to be the surname you give. You have to put the name of the creature you're making. So anyway, I hope you liked her. If you do and you want to download her on the gallery, gallery name is 080. I'm going to write it down in the description. And if you like this video, give me a thumbs up, and if you want to check me out on Twitter, I'm there at MarsSimmer. Thanks, bye!